When we think of World War II, we usually picture battles in Europe or the Pacific. But today, we're turning the camera around and pointing it right back at the American home front. Because those 4 years of war didn't just win a victory overseas, they completely and fundamentally reshaped society right here. It's a fascinating story, so let's dive in.
I love this phrase from our source material, emergency surgery. That just nails it, doesn't it? This wasn't some slow, gradual evolution. It was a fast, drastic, and honestly pretty painful operation on the entire country. And it left behind both strengths and scars we can still see today.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with a massive economic engine that literally pulled the country out of the Great Depression. Then we'll get into the new social landscape that created, full of opportunity, but also a ton of tension. And finally, we'll look at the really complicated and contradictory legacy it all left behind.
All right, first up, the economy. The war became this economic juggernaut, unlike anything the nation had ever seen. It did in just a few years what a whole decade of policy had been struggling to do.
Okay, so this is the key takeaway right here. While the New Deal definitely helped people, it was the unbelievable scale of government spending for the war that really truly ended the Great Depression. The demand for war materials just created a level of production and employment that finally dragged the economy out of that decade-long hole.
And when I say unbelievable scale, what do I mean? Well, U.S. defense spending went up by nearly 10 times during the war, a tenfold increase. This wasn't just a stimulus package, it was a total economic rewiring, all bankrolled by the federal government. Think about it. If you were jobless in 1939, by 1942, there's a good chance you were either in a uniform or building a B-29 bomber. And this transformation was absolute. American industry literally just stopped making things for us to buy. Car plants, right? The very symbol of American consumer life, they completely retooled their assembly lines to crank out tanks and bombers. Ford's Willow Run plant, for example, went from making cars to being the biggest bomber factory on the planet. Now, this massive shift didn't just happen on its own. It took a level of federal control that was totally unprecedented. New agencies like the War Production Board, they didn't just ask factories to change. They directed the entire economy, telling them what to build, how much to build, and coordinating everything between industry, labor, and the military. It was, for all intents and purposes, a planned economy built for one single goal: winning the war.
So you have this incredible economic boom, and it has this huge social side effect. It created a massive labor vacuum because millions of men were off fighting. And that vacuum just sucked whole new groups of people into the workforce, completely changing the social fabric of the country.
And right out of this moment comes one of the most powerful icons of the 20th century, Rosie the Riveter. And she wasn't just a cool poster. She represented millions of real women who stepped into jobs that were always considered men's work. And they proved they could do it, and do it really well. This just blew the doors open on the social and economic possibilities for an entire generation.
And the ripple effects of this worker shortage just kept spreading. It led to things like the Bracero program, which was an agreement with Mexico to bring in temporary farm workers. And at the same time, you had countless Latino families moving from the countryside into big cities like LA and Detroit to get those good-paying jobs in the defense plants. But when you have this much change, this fast, in overcrowded cities, it basically creates a pressure cooker. And those tensions boiled over in ugly ways, like the Zoot Suit riots, where you had white servicemen brutally clashing with young Mexican-American men. It's a really tragic reminder that even in a time of national unity, that unity could be paper thin.
Which brings us to probably the biggest contradiction of the entire war effort, right? The unbelievable hypocrisy of fighting a war for freedom and democracy overseas while keeping racial segregation and discrimination alive and well at home. So in response to this glaring hypocrisy, African-American leaders and newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier launched this absolutely brilliant and strategic movement. It was called the Double V campaign.
The slogan was just perfect, so simple, so powerful, and during a war for freedom, how could you possibly argue against it? It was a rhetorical masterstroke. It basically put the federal government in this incredibly awkward position and demanded that America start living up to its own promises. And this was not just a clever slogan. It was a tool with real political teeth. When the powerful labor leader A. Philip Randolph threatened to organize a massive march on Washington to protest hiring discrimination, President Roosevelt knew he couldn't afford that kind of disruption to war production. So he acted. He issued Executive Order 8802. This wasn't just a moral victory.
It was a political win, forced by strategic pressure. And yet, even as some civil rights were being advanced under pressure, the very same war produced the single most shocking violation of civil liberties on the home front. All of it fueled by wartime hysteria and deep-seated racism. This was the weapon. In the months of panic right after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Now, it sounds kind of bureaucratic. It authorized the military to create exclusion zones where they could remove anyone they wanted to. And that order was really only used against one group of people. Over 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast were forced out of their homes, their farms, their businesses, many of them with just a few days' notice, to pack up whatever they could carry. And here is the absolutely devastating part. 2/3 of all the people forced into these remote barbed wire camps were Nisei. They were U.S.-born American citizens, stripped of their constitutional rights and imprisoned by their own government with zero due process. And the legal system? It completely failed to protect them. In the famous Korematsu case, the Supreme Court actually upheld the internment. They called it a martial necessity to prevent sabotage, even though there was a complete lack of any evidence of disloyalty. It set a terrifying precedent, and it would be decades before the nation even began to apologize for this huge betrayal of its own ideals. So let's try to pull all these different threads together. The American home front was a place of wild contradiction. It's a story of both incredible power and incredible peril. The legacy of the war at home is just profoundly two-sided. On the one hand, it proved that a mobilized federal government could do amazing things, like ending the Great Depression. It created new opportunities for women and forced some early critical wins for civil rights. But on the other hand, it showed that same immense power could be turned around and used to crush the liberties of its own citizens. And that right there is the central tension we're left with. The war effort revealed the incredible potential of government action to solve gigantic problems with stunning speed, but it also laid bare the immense danger of that power, especially when it's fueled by fear. And so that leaves us with a question that echoes way beyond World War II. At what point does a national emergency, this idea of a martial necessity, become a blank check to sacrifice the fundamental rights of a nation's people? It's the lesson from the home front that is frankly as relevant today as it was then.